Welcome to Secret Story. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel. After a year in college I had become very disillusioned with my prospects. Not only was I failing my classes but I felt like a little cog in a big machine, a machine designed to extract money from people like me. However, my parents had high expectations and I didn't want to disappoint them. After much consideration, I figured I would take a semester off to figure things out. As expected, my parents were not only disappointed but angry as well. "So, what the hell are you going to do?" my father asked. "I don't know yet," I replied. My mother joined in on the scolding and pretty soon I felt like a failure. As I retreated to my room my father yelled, "Maybe you should join the Marines, that way you can get your shit straight." I wanted to yell something back but I really didn't have anything to say. It also didn't help that my dad was old, hard-ass Marine. The next few weeks were hell. My parents were unrelenting and reminded me about my shortcomings daily. I had gotten a job at a local insurance agency but I felt like my parents didn't want me in their house anymore. I had always been an outdoors person and I tried to stay out of the house as much as possible, but the situation was becoming unbearable. Every day there was an argument about how school was the only option and how I had to either go back or start thinking about moving out. All this bickering finally subsided the day my dad got a phone call from his sister. My Uncle James had passed away due to a heart attack and we had to fly over to pay our final farewell to my Uncle James. It wasn't a long flight considering it was from California to Idaho. It was nice to see my cousin and my aunt after such a long time, 3 years to be exact. It was sad to see them in their misery but I really loved them and was glad I could be there with them. My uncle had been a very reserved man and I had grown to like him over the years but I never really knew all that well. My aunt on the other hand, had always been was very loving and motherly. She had the warmth that came from working with animals and was always very polite. My cousin Megan was 23 and she was attending school back east and had flown back as soon as she had heard about her father. She was older than me by 4 years but she had always seemed much older to me. She had always been wise beyond her years and she had always been a full-grown woman in my eyes. We arrived Friday night and were planning to leave Sunday night after the funeral. Pleasantries and condolences were exchanged as expected that first night. The older folk, including my parents, talked with my aunt and other family members far into the night. I on the other hand decided to turn in early. I was given my uncle's old study and I found it very hard to sleep. The man had passed away yet here were traces of his existence all around me. Mercifully I dozed asleep. The next morning I awoke to my father's hand gently shaking me. "John, wake up." It was hard to stay asleep with his big bare paw on my shoulder. "Listen," he said as I turned to see him. "I know lately I've been riding you pretty hard and I'm sorry. I know you'll figure it out and I just want you to know that I got your back no matter what you choose to do," he finished with a smile. The talk last night must have really opened his eyes to how fleeting life really was. I was still half asleep but I felt a big weight lift off my shoulders both literally and emotionally. "Now get up, we have some work to do," he finished. Although I didn't admit it to myself, I knew deep inside what work he had in mind. Every time we visited my aunt we ended up helping around the farm. Unlike back home where the day started at 7 or 8 a.m., it started at 5 or 6 a.m. here. I got my clothes and jacket and followed my dad as we headed out towards the small field behind my aunt's barn. Our family has always grown in or around farms so it was second nature to my father, when it came to farm work. I on the other hand, was a little less experienced but I wasn't unwilling to jump right in. Being on my father's good side renewed my attitude on life. Soon we were milking the small herd of cows my uncle and aunt owned. By the time we were done my forearms felt sore and my dad laughed as he watched me open and close my hand. "Your uncle really liked that cow. He used to say it was the best damn cow he had ever owned," he said this while looking back at the herd. I also looked back and could see the steam rising from the cows' backs. The mornings here truly felt magical. The sky was golden as the sun rose over the hilltops. It was a beautiful scene to say the least. By the time we got back to the house, the women had already started breakfast. The house was bustling with people as neighbors and friends came to offer their condolences. The rest of the day went just like that. People coming and leaving while my aunt tried her best to remain a good host. Tomorrow would be my uncle's funeral, and it was really starting to set in that he was really gone. Late that evening, a small circle of men sat around a fire outside my aunt's house. I could see they were all men who were all a lot like my uncle, landowners and men of integrity. My dad was talking to them and I decided to join them. They were talking about my uncle and the kind of man he was. Stories about some of his crazy ideas and sayings. All in all, it was a good feeling as I learned more about the man who I knew so little about. I soon found out that my uncle had not only been a good husband to my aunt but a very good friend to all of them. He had at one time or another helped each one of these men. They were really saddened to have lost him so soon. He had only been 46. My aunt was only 40. Soon the talk took a somber tone as one man asked my father, "Has Rose told you what she plans to do with the farm?" "No, not yet," my father replied calmly. "I will talk to her before I go and make sure she has what she needs. In any case, she's a strong woman and she has that going for her," he finished as he took a drink from his beer. After a few seconds my dad spoke again. "I haven't talked to her yet, but in any case I think John might stay here with her for a while." I had my eyes fixated on the fire this whole time but processed what he had said. "What about it?" asked my dad, as he patted my back. "Sounds like a plan." I replied, wondering if he was drunk. With that being said, the men eased back on their chairs, watched the fire before them. I stood up to take a piss. I walked behind an old tractor that had been there for as long as I could remember and unleashed a small torrent on the side of one of the rear wheels. "You could go inside and do that," I heard my cousin's voice in the dark. Quickly, I zipped up my jeans and looked up to where the voice was coming from. My cousin was laying on her back on top of the engine compartment of the tractor. "I'm sorry," I muttered, embarrassed. Hearing my voice, she quickly turned to see me. "Oh, it's you," she said, surprised. I tried kicking some dirt over the little pond I had created. She smiled only slightly. "I wonder what my mom would think," she started. "She used to yell at my dad for on that exact same spot, you know," she said sadly. I looked down and noticed the distinct difference in color of some of the grass by the rear and front wheel of the tractor. When I looked back up at her, I could see her eyes watering and knew she was trying not to cry. She slowly turned around and I stood there wondering what to do. Although I wasn't very close to my cousin, I had always had a small crush on her and it had been very hard to hide it when I was younger. I kept thinking that if I remembered my indiscretions then she sure as hell would too. As a kid I had been bold enough to feel her up multiple times until the day she slapped me and threatened to tell her dad. But even now, she had always been a looker. She had her mother's brown wavy hair and pretty face to go with it. She was shorter than her mom but had inherited. "I'm sorry about your dad," I said slowly. "Thanks," she said, still facing away. Without a word I climbed up the side of the tractor and leaned over her. She was sniffling and the hood of her sweater covered her face. She smiled and I jumped back off the side of the old beast. I headed back to the house a little relieved and feeling generally good about myself. The next morning we had the funeral. The entire day was sad ordeal. I soon realized how much I hated seeing my mom and aunt cry. My dad had an arm around my aunt but her shoulders still shook hard. I didn't feel like crying but watching my mother sob broke my composure and I could feel my eyes watering. My cousin was sobbing uncontrollably and I was glad her friends around her. She had always been Daddy's little girl and now she was reeling having seen her father's casket buried. We stayed there hours after the funeral had ended and I couldn't help but contemplate all the changes death brought. On the way back home my father and I talked about what he had said yesterday. I had given it very little thought considering he had been a little tipsy, but now I saw he was completely serious. We had a long discussion about how it might be good if I stayed with my aunt for a few weeks, and I couldn't help but agree. I really was perfect for the task. I had nothing waiting for me back home, and I was grateful for a change in scenery. Being able to get my father off my back was another blessing that I sealed the deal. My father didn't waste any time proposing the idea to my aunt about me staying. First thing out of her mouth was, "Don't you have school?" I smiled and replied, "Not for a couple of months." It was the truth, school had ended and she didn't need to know that I planned on skipping next semester. My cousin, on the other hand, would be heading back as soon as she could find a flight. She had signed up for summer session and needed to be back that very week. After some discourse it was agreed that I would stay. My father took me aside and informed me that he would be depositing some funds to help with the expenses. I was glad, considering I had only a few $100s from my last job. Hours later, my parents got their things ready for their morning flight and I once again turned in earlier than usual. I spent the next couple of minutes thinking about what the next days would bring. I would be staying with my recently widowed aunt on a small farm. Freedom at last, I thought. The next morning I awoke to the sound of my parents leaving. I kissed my mother goodbye and hugged my dad for a long time. "Take good care of her," he said in his deep voice. "I will." My aunt had always been very close to my dad and I could feel the weight behind his request. My aunt hugged each of them as well, and my mom finished by saying, "You give me a call if he gives you any trouble, and don't be afraid to smack him if he acts up. You have my permission," she said, smiling. "I wouldn't dream of it," my Aunt Rose answered as she looked at me lovingly. I waved them goodbye as the cab pulled away. When I turned around, my aunt was in the doorway smiling at me. She opened her arms. That day I spent most of the time cleaning around the house and farm. My aunt spent it indoors mainly. I found it incredibly difficult to talk to her about my uncle, and I was dreading the fact that my cousin would be leaving the very next day. The day flew by as I explored the farm and the rest of the grounds. I could see myself falling in love with this lifestyle. "Take good care of my mom, John," Megan told me. "Don't worry, I will," I answered reassuringly. I had driven my cousin to the airport and it was now time to say goodbye. Megan had suggested to my aunt that she'd stay a while longer. But my aunt would have nothing of it. "No, Megan, you need to finish up your schoolwork, and besides, I'll be fine with John here." And so it was. My cousin flew back east to finish her classes and I became my aunt's only company. The next few days consisted of me getting accustomed to the routine. To my surprise, my aunt knew as much, if not more, than my father when it came to tending a farm. I found myself following her lead most of the time. As the days went on, I found myself more and more comfortable around her. In the days following the funeral we had become close friends. I recounted my stories of past girlfriends and my aunt recounted how my uncle and her had met. On some days I could see the sadness in her eyes, and I tried my best to keep her spirits high. Slowly I began to grow more and more fond of her. Major changes started occurring after my aunt stopped wearing her black attire. Since the funeral she had been wearing nothing but black, but after 2 weeks she was back to her normal wear. The truth was that her black clothes just didn't cut it when it came to working on the farm. However, with this change also came some unexpected challenges. I couldn't help but stare at her after she started wearing her everyday work clothes. She was truly well endowed in this respect. The years had taken some of the perkiness away, but in its place, a beautiful body now remained. One day as I was working on a fence near the barn, I saw her washing some rags on an old-fashioned washboard. I felt ashamed and embarrassed at my reaction, but what could I do? It had been weeks since I had any sort of release. It also didn't help that I was now sleeping in my cousin's room. That night, however, I was unable to keep. In the silence of the night I pictured my aunt. The next morning I noticed I had no clothes left in my suitcase. I had only packed for a few days and now I was shit of luck. I tried looking for the jeans I had worn the day before, but I didn't see them anywhere. I stayed in my room for a little while wondering what to do. After a while, however, I heard my aunt yell from the kitchen, "John, what do you want for breakfast?" "Anything is fine by me, Aunt Rose," I yelled back. A few minutes later I heard her yell again, "Breakfast is almost ready." I yelled back, I can't find my jeans." A couple seconds passed and I was about to yell again when I heard her say, "Oh honey, I think they are all in the wash. They're almost done, but you better get over here before your breakfast gets cold," she said finally. I searched the room for a towel but found none. I tried to make it to my seat at the table before my aunt turned around, but I was too late. "Oh honey, you don't wear boxers?" she asked, smiling as she wiped her hands on her apron. No, I don't really like them," I replied. "I'm sorry honey, I didn't know those were all your jeans. I would have left one had I known," she informed me. "It's okay, Aunt Rose, I appreciate you washing them," I replied. My embarrassment had already been extremely high, but now I could feel my face turning red. She started scrambling some eggs while in her PJs. "Honey, can you get me the flour that's behind you in that cupboard? I'm going to make some pancakes," she said. "Oh, that's okay, Aunt Rose, I don't want any pancakes," I replied, hoping she wouldn't ask me to get something else. "Well, I do, so if you could please," she said. I stood up quickly and started looking through the pantry. Finally, I found the flour and turned around. I thought about tossing the flour box to her but decided against it. I walked quickly, trying to cover. When I got close to her, I extended it to her. "How about you help me make them?" she said. It was now that I noticed that she was relishing in my discomfort. She had a hint of deviance in her eyes. "I don't really know how to make them," I was really trying to save myself from being so exposed. "That's okay, I'll teach you," she replied quickly. She grabbed the box out of my hand and then I saw her eyes deviate down. I looked down to see how obvious my condition was, but to my horror it was worse than I could imagine. This as well, because she let out a smile when she caught my stare. I got an idea. She sprung up all of a sudden. Slowly she turned around and my mouth dropped. "See, now we are even," she said, smiling. She sat down across the table. "Honey, you might be able to chew your food better if you close your mouth now and again," she said coyly. I roused myself and tried to concentrate on my food. Soon, however, breakfast was over. "Better not tell your dad, or your mom," she said jokingly. "I won't," I managed to say, my embarrassment effectively gone. "Now you better get out there and work some of that energy off," she said. "Will do," I replied. "And one more thing, Han," she said as I started to walk out of the kitchen, "we need to get you some new." I managed to let out a small laugh and say, "Yeah, I know. That day I worked like a workhorse and didn't stop until the sun came down." By the time I got back from the field, a heavy rainstorm had started to unleash its fury. My aunt had dinner waiting and I wasted no time in changing and eating the hearty meal. After dinner we went to the porch to see the rain coming down. It was really pouring and I couldn't help but smile as my aunt cuddled next to me. She shuddered after every thunderclap and I couldn't help but feel more manly as she took comfort at my side. After a while the wind became too strong and we decided to head inside. "Do you mind sleeping in my room tonight? I'm kinda of a scaredy cat when it comes to thunder," she asked all of a sudden. "No, I don't mind, Aunt Rose," I replied, maybe a little too quickly. "It's just, I never really liked lightning and thunder." She trailed off. Your uncle used to tease me about that." Her voice wandered off as she remembered her dead husband. "It's okay, I don't mind sleeping in your room," I said. I had planned to not act on my natural tendencies and behave as gentlemanly as possible. I had fought the battle in my head already and I had won. I would only comfort her and nothing more. I held her all through the night as the lightning and thunder prevailed long into the night. Although I had decided to not cross the moral line, my body didn't know any better. I struggled to sleep as I considered the fact that my uncle had slept on this very bed. I awoke a few times to hear my aunt sobbing quietly, By the end of the day my body ached and small blisters appeared on my hand from where I had gripped the hammer. My aunt had always been attentive to my needs, but when I arrived I immediately noticed a change in her demeanor. Where before, she had treated me as her young clueless nephew, she now spoke to me no different than a wife would speak to a husband. "What would like to eat, dear?" she asked while she folded my coat. "I'll eat anything," I told her. "I'm starving." "All right then, spaghetti it is," she said. "Maybe later, I can give you a massage, honey, it looks like you can use it," she added. Indeed, I really could use one. My arms and back were burning. "Yeah, that sounds nice," I replied. "You better get washed up then," she suggested. I headed into the shower. I slid back the clear glass door of the shower and stepped inside as the warm water started to steam up around me. I had small cuts on my hands and using the soap stung them as I washed. Nevertheless, I persevered and washed as best I could. I was fully lathered in soap when I heard a knock at the door. "Yes," I called out. "Honey, I have a wash going. Do you have your clothes in here?" "I didn't see them in your room," she said. "Yeah, they're in here," I replied as I tried to wash some of the soap off my face. Slowly the door creaked open and I saw my aunt gingerly step in. I had left my clothes right outside the shower door, so she had no choice but to venture all the way inside. Unlike the day before, I found myself lacking any sense of embarrassment. I watched my aunt's eyes as she desperately tried to concentrate on the pile of clothes. Although the steam did provide some cover, it wasn't enough to stifle her curiosity. "John, honestly," she stammered. I laughed out loud at her befuddlement. Quickly she gathered herself and walked out of the bathroom. Although I had committed myself not to cross the line, I found myself not trying very hard. I finished my shower. I thought about getting some shorts on before heading into the living room, but as I stared down the hallway I was entranced by my aunt, who was sitting Indian-style reading a book. She had her reading glasses on and her brown hair fell down the left side of her face. She looked a lot younger sitting like that next to the fireplace. In a daze I walked towards her. Before I made my presence known, she put her book down and stretched. Her arms reached for the ceiling and her back arched like a limber gymnast. As she lowered her arms she saw me. She extended the towel on the carpet and laid a pillow on one side. "Well, come over here, child," she beckoned with both hands. I strode towards her. After a few minutes she asked me to flip over. A couple of things happened at once when I did. I flipped over, not thinking twice. My aunt had turned around to grab a small cloth and squeeze some more oil out of the bottle. She hesitated only slightly before turning back to face me. You can imagine my aunt's reaction when she turned. After a few seconds of silence I saw her inch towards me. She did this for a few minutes before I heard a quiet sniffle. She had started to cry. I quickly sat up and she said, "I loved your uncle very much, you know." I felt sick thinking that I had made a mistake. Guilt rose in me like never before. "We don't have to do this if you don't want to, Aunt Rose," I said cautiously. "No, baby, it's not that." She wiped her tears. "I'm not sad. I just really miss your uncle, but I'm so glad you're here. I'm so happy you are here taking care of me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." I sat up even straighter. Having gotten the green light, my natural instincts took over. She quickly looked up with a face of confusion and disappointment. I smiled at her and she responded by making a funny angry face. Okay, I said as I offered her my once again. She crossed her arms and looked up and away in a classic fashion of "I'm no interested." I regretted my teasing immediately. I watched her and examined her. This was it. There was no turning back. She was my aunt, yes, but the morality of such an act, I didn't care. It didn't matter that my father had entrusted her to me, and it didn't matter that I was so much younger than her. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. No part of this story can be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means without written permission from the author. All characters are fictitious, and any similarity to actual people, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental unless otherwise stated. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel. Story 2, Heather and I were married, not to each other mind you. Heather and Grant were neighbors to Terry and I, and we got together often. Not that kind of get together, just evenings together playing board games, watching movies or just visiting. Heather was the woman I knew. Some women are nice to look at. Heather was one. My wife Terry is good looking, but Heather was more than just attractive. About a year ago, Grant announced he was getting a promotion at work, so we had them over for a little celebration. We bought some champagne and made a big dinner for them. As we ate and drank, the champagne soon ran out and we switched to harder drinks. Grant told us he was going to have to be out of town about 1 week a month with his new position. His first trip would be the week after next. How do you feel about being left alone while Grant is away? Terry asked Heather. I don't know, I'll have to find something to keep me busy, I guess. I could definitely keep you busy. Brent? Earth to Brent, came through the fog. Did you hear me? Terry asked. Oh, sorry, daydreaming, I replied. Grant was saying that Heather may need your help with the lawn and stuff when he is away. You'll help, won't you? Oh, sure. It's just that I hate using that riding mower, Heather said. I'll tell you what, I suggested, if I can use your riding mower to cut my lawn, I'll do yours too. Deal. Grant answered, while I'm away, if you need use of anything of mine, help yourself. If only. I thought, subtly leering at Heather as I continued my fantasy that I never thought about the lawn again until about 2 weeks later. On a Tuesday evening after dinner, as my wife was leaving for her night shift, she mentioned that I should get the lawns cut. You promised Grant and Heather you'd cut theirs as well, she added as she stepped out. That I got changed into some shorts and a t-shirt and headed over to Heather's to borrow the riding lawn mower. I was looking forward to seeing Heather again, but had no idea how this evening was going to turn out. As I stepped up to the back door, I straightened my shirt and pressed the doorbell. Who is it? Heather called from inside. Brent, I answered. Oh, come on in, Brent. I'll be right there. I opened the door and stepped inside. I could smell the scent of Heather's perfume, and although I'd been in this house many times, I realized it has always been the four of us. It was never just Heather and I alone. Heather appeared down the hallway and, as always, sorry, I was just putting in some laundry. Excuse the way I look, these are my exercise clothes. I was just about to get in a little workout. You look great. Where do you work out? Well, thanks, she said with a smile. I just work out here at home. I have a few exercise videos that I use. It's probably not as effective as joining a club or something, but I can do it whenever I have time. I would guess you find the time often enough, I ventured, then cut off any further comment, worried that I had spoken my fantasy life too far into reality. Heather blushed slightly, then responded, well, thanks, Brent. I do what I can, she added. I'm glad you noticed, it's nice to be appreciated, then turned to reach something in the cupboard. As she reached high in the cupboard, I was mesmerized. Then as she turned her head to me, I was also caught. Heather was looking at me as I stared at her. As quickly as I could, I looked up to her face. Her expression showed no anger or embarrassment, though, a mischievous grin actually spread across her lips. I wanted to say something to relieve the tension I felt and retain some dignity, but she beat me to it. Yep, it sure is nice to be appreciated, she repeated with a giggle. I'm sure my face was blood red with embarrassment, and I stammered to say something. I felt like an idiot. Heather laughed. Don't be embarrassed, Brent. If it bothered me that you were at I would have told you long ago. This isn't the first time I've seen you do it, you know. Really? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you. Oh, Brent, don't worry about it. If it bothered me I would have said something. It's kind of flattering actually. Besides, I have been ogled by men since I was a teenager. I never felt threatened by you or anything, so relax. Now, I can't speak for Grant and Terry, mind you, they might have a different opinion. Since Grant is in Europe he can't say much right now though. She grinned, then added, where is Terry tonight? Just left for the hospital. She's working tonight, I added, my mind still racing. She reminded me to cut the grass before she left. Ah, Heather replied, you came to borrow the mower. Well, the lawn isn't that bad, I replied, matching her grin. Oh good. It's been way too quiet around here with Grant gone. Would you like a drink? Sure, whatever you're going to have, I responded as I slipped off my sneakers and followed her toward the den. As she led the way down the hall she reached behind her with both hands and playfully pulled her shirt down. She looked over her shoulder, giggling and scurrying down the hall. Haha, I said. Now I don't feel embarrassed at all. Hee hee. A girl can't be too careful. She responded. Some men can't control themselves. How is your willpower, Brent? She asked. Well, I promise not to touch, I can't promise not to look. Haha. Good answer, she replied as we stepped into the den. Heather poured us each a vodka and 7, handed me one and invited me to sit on the couch as she dropped into the seat. So how have you been making out with Grant away? Oh, okay, I guess, a little lonely is all. I imagine. When is he due home? The day after tomorrow. I have a big welcome home planned for him. Really? Yep, making a big dinner and then a romantic evening at home. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, they say. Not just the heart, she winked and giggled. Now don't go there, I sighed, I think we all know what else grows fonder. Oh, sorry, does that make you uncomfortable? Well, I wouldn't say uncomfortable, it's just that I'm afraid what I might say. Oh, okay, she half pouted, I would like to have a man's perspective on what would be a good romantic evening. But if it would bother you, I'll have to wing it. No, it's okay. I'd love to help. Have you got some ideas? Oh, lots. She seemed excited to share them. I even went shopping. She smiled coyly. She stood and I thought she was going to show me what she had shopped for, but she held up her empty glass. Another drink? Sure. I answered, what kind of shopping? Well. Let's see. A few things. She hesitated as she returned with the drinks. She took her seat and continued. Let me ask this right up front, Brent. I hope you aren't embarrassed, but are you and Terry adventurous? I stammered, not as much as, well, why do you ask? Well, because, she paused then leaned toward me and lowered her voice in a more secretive tone, Brent, we've been friends for quite a while. Can we decide that this conversation is just between us, and we have to be honest? I nodded and she continued, I have occasionally talked to women about these things, but never a man. I'd love to know your point of view. Sure. We'll keep it to ourselves, she asked with a look that no man would be able to resist. Absolutely. Great. She seemed excited. Well. I might as well start at the start, she said. I am a very person, the problem is, Grant isn't so much. Ah, I see. I replied. Was he ever? She paused, this is cool being so open. Heather smiled, her eyes wide with excitement of telling her deep secrets. I know what you're saying, and I can sympathize. Exactly. Heather replied. It is so cool to have someone to talk to about this, especially someone who can relate. Heather looked thoughtful for a bit and then started to laugh. What? I guess that might explain why you are always checking me out when you think nobody is looking. She giggled. Well, I guess that is part of it. I responded, still slightly embarrassed that I added. Maybe subconsciously I can sense that you aren't getting enough either. She smiled broadly, thank you Brent, you flatterer. And so far as getting enough, I'm not, believe me. A beautiful woman like you that needs more attention, no. I was sure tempered a few times though. I hear ya. Same here. Well, if you've never fooled around, how do you get rid of your tension? I asked with a laugh. That helps take my mind off of it, but does nothing to relieve that kind of tension. So. She mimicked as she grinned, blushing. Well. What do you do? I grinned, appearing innocent. You know very well what I do. It's the same thing you do and everyone else does. She replied, apparently embarrassed but not hedging on the conversation. Oh. I answered, appearing to just catch on. You mean? Yep, I do that lots. Heather laughed out loud. I can't believe where this conversation has gone, she said. Well, since we promised to be honest, I do too, she added with laughter that was tinged with embarrassment. Does Grant know you play? No, I think it would insult him if he knew I needed more. Maybe. So how do you get away with it? Oh, sorry, I laughed, it just intrigues me. Envisioning a beautiful woman, enjoying herself, is what I do when I play. I wanted to get the details right, I smiled. Good answer, she giggled, then as she squirmed in her seat a bit. She added, I guess that's another thing we have in common. Really? She held up her glass, again. Sure, but I have to use the washroom. I'll be right back. Okay, I have to change over the laundry as well, make yourself comfortable. After using the washroom I returned to the den and waited for Heather. When I sipped my drink I could taste the vodka in it. Heather was pouring heavy and had been obviously teasing me. I was wondering where this evening was headed. After a few minutes I heard Heather come down the hall behind me. So Brent. She called, you promised to give me your opinion of what you would consider romantic. That's right, I did, I responded, not turning around. Okay. A promise is a promise, she continued from behind me. I wondered what she was getting at, but as she came into my field of view I knew. What other promises did you make? She asked in that delightfully naughty tone. To be honest. And? I didn't know what she was getting to. Oh, right. I remembered, look, but don't touch. Right, she laughed. I wanted your opinion on an outfit I bought for when Grant gets home. I am sure I can give you that opinion right now. I'm sure any man would love whatever you are wearing under that housecoat, but not touching, you might be asking too much. That is just teasing, you know, I answered with a smile. Well, if you can't promise not to touch. I guess I'll have to go change. No looking for you, she teased as she started to turn around to leave the room. I promise. I promise. Well, okay. If you promise, she answered. Then she slowly turned her back to me. Heather winked at me, then dropped her arms. The weight of the housecoat did the rest. Heather smiled in appreciation at my reaction. She paused for a moment, allowing my eyes to take it all in, then spoke in an exaggerated voice. So, do you think that this outfit would be a good start to a romantic evening? I was completely speechless. Here was my fantasy. So close, and yet I couldn't touch. What agony. Oh man. You're gorgeous, Heather. I managed to say. Ah, thank you. She added as she looked and you seem to have answered my question. I squirmed in my seat, trying to relieve the pressure. I guess so. I envy Grant. What makes you envy Grant the most? All of you. All of you. I've always thought so. Flatterer. I love it, she giggled. I'm not just flattering you, honest. You said yourself you caught me watching you before. Well, how do I know that isn't something you do all the time? Oh, please don't. You look way too good. Well, that is the truth. Have you ever cheated on Terry? Nope, but like you, I have been tempted. I had never cheated on my wife. I am going to make a logical argument. You see if there are any flaws in it. Okay. She answered, well, if I happened to walk in on you and Grant, that wouldn't be cheating, would it? No. Unless you joined in. Her eyes betrayed her, the thought of being with two men intrigued her. I'd have to keep that in mind. Right, I agreed. She answered with a little smile crossing her face. So, by this reasoning it wouldn't really be cheating, I said in a slightly hushed voice, if we happen to see each, providing we never put our hands on each other, just ourselves. Heather was obviously as intrigued by the idea as I was. No, by definition, that wouldn't be cheating, she replied. I have to agree, there is nothing wrong with that argument. I like the way you think, Brent. Brent, she spoke, I'll be right back, I want to get something. As I sat down, on the couch once again, I heard Heather returning. She stepped into the room with a shoe box in her hands. As she came around the couch she laughed as she saw me. Well, when in Rome, she said as she set the box down, she was the vision of beauty that writers and poets try to describe. For Heather, the words couldn't do justice, I was in awe of her beauty. You like? She asked rhetorically. Brent, she called in a curious tone as she reached for the shoe box, guess what I have in this box, do you? She replied excitedly. Grant hates them. He doesn't know I have these. I keep them hidden. Terry doesn't like them either. Haven't used them on her in a long time. And you don't have any of your own? I wasn't sure what she meant, but I answered, no, she got rid of all of them. Well, Grant doesn't know I have these, I keep this box with the rest of my shoes, she giggled, want to see? Okay. Here is my favorite, she said, pulling an odd-looking device from the box. Why your favorite? I asked. Oh, it does lots all at the same time. Looks like fun, I answered, enthralled by her description. I was looking forward to watching her use it. My mommy taught me to share, she said, so use anything you'd like. I'd like? What did she mean by that? I wondered. I don't think I need one, I admitted, but would love to see you use them. I thought you said you liked, she asked, a bit disappointed. I do, but I never used them on myself. Ever wanted to? Honestly, I never considered it. Would you try tonight, for me? She asked with a look that no man could refuse. Well, okay. I'll try it. Would you? Definitely. Heather's breathing finally relaxed some. It was my best for years too, I told her. Can we do this again, and again? She smiled. You think we should? What if Grant and Terry find out? They won't. If we're careful. Would you like to now?